In November of 1903, a country that did not exist on Monday existed on Wednesday. By Friday, that brand new country had signed a treaty giving the United States control of a strip of its territory forever. The country was Panama. The treaty gave America the right to build the most important waterway in the world. And the entire thing, the revolution, the recognition, the treaty, the warships, was orchestrated from Washington by a president who later said, and these are his actual words, "I took the isthmus, started the canal, and then left Congress not to debate the canal but to debate me." This is the story of how the United States did not just build the Panama Canal, it built an entire country to put the canal in. To understand why the United States was willing to manufacture a nation to dig a ditch, you have to understand how important that ditch was. At the turn of the 20th century, a ship sailing from New York to San Francisco had to travel 13,000 miles around the southern tip of South America through the Strait of Magellan. The passage was dangerous, expensive, and absurdly long. A canal cutting through Central America would reduce the journey to roughly 5,000 miles. It would save weeks of travel time. It would cut fuel costs dramatically, and it would allow the U.S. Navy to move warships between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans in days instead of months. The strategic importance became painfully clear during the Spanish-American War of 1898. When the battleship USS Oregon was needed in Cuba, it had to steam all the way around South America. The voyage took 67 days. Military planners in Washington watched the calendar in horror. If the U.S. was going to be a two-ocean power, it needed a shortcut. The canal was no longer a luxury. It was a matter of national security. The French had already tried to build a canal and failed spectacularly. In 1881, Ferdinand de Lesseps, the man who had built the Suez Canal, launched a massive effort to cut a sea-level canal through the Isthmus of Panama, which at the time was a province of Colombia. De Lesseps was a diplomat, not an engineer, and he made a fatal assumption. He believed Panama would be like Suez. It was not. Suez was flat desert. Panama was mountainous jungle. The terrain was brutal. Torrential rains caused constant landslides that swallowed months of excavation in minutes. The Chagres River flooded unpredictably, washing out equipment and drowning workers. And the jungle carried diseases that were far more lethal than any engineering challenge. Yellow fever and malaria devastated the workforce. Workers died by the thousands. Hospitals were overwhelmed. The death toll climbed to staggering levels. Modern estimates suggest that approximately 20,000 workers died during the French attempt. The company burned through nearly 1.4 billion gold francs raised mostly from small French investors. By 1889, the company was bankrupt. De Lesseps and his son were indicted for fraud. Some 800,000 French citizens lost their entire investment. It was the largest financial scandal of the 19th century. The dream of a Panama Canal was buried in mud, debt, and graves. But the idea refused to die. In 1902, the United States purchased the remaining French assets in Panama for $40 million. Now they needed permission to build. Panama belonged to Colombia, so the U.S. negotiated a treaty with the Colombian government. The Hay-Herran Treaty of 1903 offered Colombia $10 million up front and an annual payment of $250,000 in exchange for a 100-year lease on a 6-mile wide canal zone. The U.S. Senate ratified the treaty, but the Colombian Senate rejected it. The Colombians felt the terms were insulting. They wanted more money. They were worried about losing sovereignty over a strip of their own territory. They believed that if they waited, the French concession would expire and they could negotiate even better terms. President Theodore Roosevelt was furious. He had staked his presidency on the canal. He viewed the Colombian rejection as an act of obstruction by what he privately called those contemptible little creatures in Bogota. He was not a man who accepted no for an answer. And he did not need to, because there was an alternative. Panama had never been a comfortable fit inside Colombia. The isthmus was separated from the rest of the country by the impassable Darien Gap, a wall of jungle so thick that even today there is no road through it. Panamanians had attempted to break away from Colombia multiple times throughout the 19th century. There was a genuine independence movement with real local support. What it lacked was the military muscle to succeed. Roosevelt provided that muscle. In September 1903, a Panamanian doctor named Manuel Amador Guerrero traveled to New York to coordinate with American contacts. He was put in touch with Felipe Bunau Varilla, a French engineer who had been involved in the original French canal effort and who had a massive financial stake in seeing a canal built. Bunau Varilla had purchased the remaining French canal assets and stood to make a fortune if the Americans proceeded. He wrote the conspirators a check for $100,000 to fund the revolution. He also arranged for Amador to meet with President Roosevelt. Roosevelt was careful not to explicitly endorse the revolt, but the message was unmistakable. If Panama declared independence, the United States would look upon it favorably. On November 2, 1903, the USS Nashville arrived at the port of Colon on Panama's Caribbean coast. The next day, November 3rd, Panama declared independence. The timing was not a coincidence. The presence of the American warship was the revolution's insurance policy. When Colombia dispatched 500 soldiers to crush the uprising, the American-controlled Panama Railroad conveniently removed its trains from the northern terminus, stranding the Colombian troops. They had no way to reach Panama City where the revolution was taking place. Additional U.S. warships arrived and positioned themselves on both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. The Colombian soldiers, facing American naval guns and unable to cross the isthmus, had no choice but to leave. There was almost no bloodshed. The only casualty of Panamanian independence was a Chinese shopkeeper killed by a stray shell from a Colombian gunboat. The United States recognized the Republic of Panama on November 6th, 3 days after the declaration. It was one of the fastest diplomatic recognitions in history, and the speed of what came next was equally breathtaking. Varilla, the French engineer who had bankrolled the revolution, was appointed as Panama's ambassador to the United States. Think about that for a moment. The man representing the brand new country of Panama in Washington was not Panamanian. He was a French businessman with a direct financial interest in the canal being built, and he was the one who negotiated the treaty. The Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty was signed on November 18, 1903, just 15 days after Panama declared independence. The terms were extraordinarily favorable to the United States. America received a 10-mile wide zone across the entire isthmus in perpetuity. The word perpetuity is important. It did not mean a lease. It meant forever. Within that zone, the United States would exercise, in Roosevelt's words, the equivalent of sovereignty. It was American territory in all but name. In exchange, Panama received $10 million and an annual payment of $250,000. The Panamanian leaders who had organized the revolution were presented with the treaty and given an implicit ultimatum: sign it or lose American protection. Without the U.S. warships, the Colombian army would return and the revolutionaries would be executed. They signed. Many Panamanians immediately condemned the treaty as an infringement on their new sovereignty, but they were a country that was 2 weeks old and had no bargaining power. Construction of the canal began in 1904. The Americans succeeded where the French had failed, largely because of two innovations. The first was medical. Colonel William Gorgas led a campaign to eradicate the mosquitoes that carried yellow fever and malaria. By draining standing water, fumigating buildings, and screening living quarters, the Americans dramatically reduced the disease that had killed 20,000 French workers. The second innovation was engineering. Chief Engineer John Stevens, and later George Washington Goethals, abandoned the French plan for a sea-level canal and instead designed a lock system that raised ships 85 feet above sea level using a series of massive concrete chambers filled with water from an artificial lake. It was a radically different approach, and it worked. The canal opened on August 15, 1914, just as World War I was beginning in Europe. The first ship to transit the canal was the SS Ancon, a cargo vessel. The engineering achievement was staggering. The canal reduced the New York to San Francisco voyage from 13,000 miles to 5,200 miles. It transformed global trade. It gave the U.S. Navy the ability to project power in two oceans simultaneously. And it made the United States the gatekeeper of the most important choke point in the Western Hemisphere. But the canal zone remained a source of friction for decades. The United States had carved a sovereign American territory through the middle of Panama, complete with its own police force, courts, schools, and government. Some 62,000 Panamanians were displaced to create the zone. Panamanians could see the American flag flying over their own country. Anti-American sentiment grew steadily. Major riots broke out in 1958, 1959, and most violently in January 1964, when clashes between Panamanian students and American soldiers left over 20 Panamanians dead. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter signed two treaties with Panama that set a timeline for transferring the canal. On December 31, 1999, the United States formally handed over control of the Panama Canal to Panama. The handover was both a strategic and economic calculation. By that point, the canal's economic importance to the United States had declined significantly. The largest modern ships could no longer fit through the original locks, and the political cost of maintaining what looked like a colonial possession in the middle of a Latin American country had become too high. In 1921, the United States paid Colombia $25 million as a kind of retroactive apology for its role in the Panamanian Revolution. Colombia, in return, recognized Panama as an independent nation. It took 18 years for the check to clear on that particular piece of geopolitics. The story of the Panama Canal is the story of American power at its most creative and its most ruthless. The United States wanted a canal, Colombia said no, so America helped create a new country that would say yes. It recognized that country in 3 days. It signed a treaty in 15. It stationed warships to ensure no one could object. And it built one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history through the middle of a nation that existed because Washington needed it to. Roosevelt never apologized. He never pretended it was anything other than what it was. He took the isthmus, he started the canal, And then he left everyone else to debate whether it was right. The canal was finished. The debate is still going.